The history of African American struggles for social, economic, and political justice did not, of course, begin in the 20th century. I have chosen that as an arbitrary starting point to highlight your theme. I believe that one can trace the history of African American civil rights struggles through the work of Black women. Historians commonly mark the beginning of the 20th century as the Progressive Era, a period characterized by dramatic reforms in politics, standards of living, urbanization, and labor. But African Americans were largely left out of the progressive vision. Education for Black children, for example, was in horrible shape. The needs and rhythms of agricultural life superseded the desire of Black parents to educate their children. So Black schools did not even run all year. In the chronically poor South, where most African Americans lived, there was little money even for white schools. So imagine the Black schools. They were overcrowded, staffed with poorly and underpaid teachers, run with second-hand and discarded materials, and governed by the belief that too much education was not needed for a workforce of menial laborers. In 1900, about 8,000 out of 1 million Black high school-age youth went to high school. The economic picture was not much better. In that same year, the average wage for industrial workers was $438 a year. But for Black farm workers who were paid a wage, they made less than $130 a year. Few could make enough money to buy their own land, which was the means for subsistence and for building equity in Black communities. Few were initially employed in factory work, and when they did enter the factories, they received the least desirable jobs for the least pay. With no relief in sight, how, wondered African Americans, could they make things better for themselves? Many African Americans turned inward to their own communities while keeping up their fight for justice in the larger society. Black women would be crucial in this fight for educational, social, and economic uplift. At the turn of the 20th century, Black women were particularly active. One of the most prominent Black woman activists of the late 19th and early 20th century was Ida B. Wells. Commonly called uncompromising and unflinching, she is best known for her work protesting the Southern horror of lynching. As a journalist and writer, Wells documented lynchings and spoke out so fiercely against them that she was run out of the South. She refused to silence herself, however. In addition to her anti-lynching work, Wells challenged the Jim Crow system of segregation, becoming one of the most prominent leaders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Wells was joined in her NAACP work by Mary Church Terrell. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Terrell, a strong advocate for the end of segregation, self-help, and uplift of Black communities through the work of Black women, was a veteran organizer and activist. She had personally challenged rail car segregation. She, and women like Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, supported a strong club movement early in the 20th century. Black women organized to care for their communities and, in their words, to uplift the race. They joined clubs that functioned as so much more than social organizations. Though Black club women initially organized to defend themselves against allegations that they were promiscuous and that Black women were not feminine, they quickly determined that they could not rise until the whole race did. These women believed that it was the job of women to save their people and that the progress of the race could be measured by their progress. Well-educated and often from privileged backgrounds, they touted themselves as their own best argument and organized youth groups, vocational training, temporary homes, and other institutions to hasten racial progress and to encourage poor Blacks to accept what they defined as proper culture and lifestyle. Club women preached what we call a politics of respectability, emphasizing what they considered good morals, along with practical pursuits like education, saving money, and institution building. Club women like Nannie Helen Burroughs, who's on the next slide, argued that women could change the world with three things: the Bible, which represented morality, the bath, which represented self-purification, and the broom, by working to clean up their environments. Club women were often the same women who sustained the strength of Black churches, themselves powerful institutions in Black communities from which much activism and support emerged. If you'll change the slides for me, please. Next slide. Here, you can also see Nannie Helen Burroughs in the front, This is in her position with the National Baptist Convention, which comes about after Black Baptists split from white Southern Baptists over segregation. But so a lot of these women worked through a lot of organizations, not just their clubs, but through churches and civil rights organizations as well. Other Black women in the first quarter of the 20th century preached an even more focused message about the need for economic opportunity and investment in Black communities. In Richmond, Virginia, Maggie Lena Walker drew on her belief in the power of community and mutual aid to convince her neighbors to invest in what would become the St. Luke's Penny Savings Bank. The bank offered loans to African Americans who were often denied credit at white-owned institutions and helped them build homes in hopes of encouraging the building of equity in the community. She would be the first Black woman to be president of a bank. Perhaps the best known Black businesswoman of the early 20th century was Madam C.J. Walker. Born Sarah Breedlove in the tiny rural town of Delta, Louisiana, she lost both of her parents at an early age and found herself as a young woman alone raising a daughter. She was a washerwoman for a while and realized via her work for other people that she was a good salesperson. So she began selling hair products with a coworker of hers and then began to develop her own, okay? And they're so popular, her hair products, her wonderful hair grower that you can see on the bottom of this slide, and she used herself as an example, that she becomes one of the first American female millionaires. She makes a lot of money selling hair products. She, like the Black club women, worried about the appearance of Black women, not just for cosmetic reasons, but again, because Black women were a lot of times denigrated for being not feminine and not beautiful, and so that was something that she wanted to change. Madam C.J. Walker toured the country, visiting groups and schools, and sharing her successful business practices. But savvy business acumen and a message of savings and thrift did not protect African Americans, a significant percentage of whom lived in desperate poverty, from the ravages of the Great Depression. About 4.5 million were agricultural workers by the 1930s, mired in systems of tenancy and sharecropping that left them permanently in debt. During the 1930s, government relief attempts, the growing use of tractors, and natural disasters combined to push millions of African Americans off the land. Other Black workers fared little better. In some cities existed a virtual slave market for Black women's domestic labor. Black women gathered on street corners to offer their labor for as little as a few pennies an hour. Some were never paid. A year after the stock market crash, in cities like Charleston, Memphis, and Chicago, Black unemployment topped 70%. Still, Black women's organizations kept up their agitation for justice, feeling that economic opportunity and investment in Black communities was more important now than ever. Next slide. In cities like Detroit, women organized housewives leagues to exert economic pressure against forces of discrimination. They refused to buy in shops where they could not work or where they felt they were cheated. They made a concerted effort to support Black-owned businesses and to teach African Americans about the power of the dollar. Another veteran of Black women's organizations who shined during the 1930s was Mary McLeod Bethune. A longtime educator and political consultant, Bethune, who had founded a college, had an unswerving belief in the power of education to uplift African Americans. She confronted segregation and racism head-on, and one of the most famous stories of her life involves her standing up to dozens of Klansmen and leading a group of Black citizens to vote. In the 1930s, Bethune worked closely with President and First Lady Roosevelt as Special Advisor on Minority Affairs and as the Director of the Division of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration. She was the first Black woman to head a federal agency. Bethune's work continued beyond the Depression years as she pressed during World War II for an end to segregation and discrimination. Her efforts were part of a much broader campaign among African Americans called the Double V Campaign, in which African Americans vowed to win victory against fascism abroad and racism at home. Black women letter writers campaigned to press the government to open economic opportunity as the country mobilized for war on a non-discriminatory basis. But one of the places African Americans were most determined to confront segregation was within the military. Next slide, please. And one woman who worked on that was Mabel Stoppers. Mabel Stoppers was a nurse. and had been involved for a very long time in improving opportunities for black nurses and black nurses to be trained, challenging segregation within the nursing profession. And during World War II, she turned her eye to the military, okay? So there's this problem where the military reports that they have a shortage of nurses because they have a quota for nurses, that they only have a certain number of black nurses that can work, okay? So black nurses find themselves mostly serving black soldiers and foreign prisoners of war. And it's not that they minded the work with the prisoners of war, but they felt like they wanted to serve and help people from their country primarily. So Mabel Stoppers and other women engaged in this campaign that finally led to the lifting of the quota on black nurses and eased the so-called shortage of nurses in the military. Okay. Black women like the ones I have discussed lay the groundwork for the concerted direct action efforts to gain social justice in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Next slide. Women such as Constance Baker Motley, who led the charge of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, helped write briefs for the famous Brown versus Board of Education case, argued before the Supreme Court in the James Meredith case that had Meredith admitted to Ole Miss. She argued 10 cases in front of the Supreme Court, won 9 of them, and the other was overturned later in her favor. So she's a brilliant lawyer, worked for the Legal Defense Fund for a while. She's the first black woman to sit on the federal bench and to become a chief judge. When we look closely at the civil rights era from a traditional point of view, it is easy to perceive it as a national, male-led effort. But historians have revealed the grassroots nature of much of the civil rights era effort and the integral role women played as organizers and mobilizers of black communities. For example, we rightfully know the story of the courageous Rosa Parks, but we have lost sight of women like Joanne Robinson, next slide, who helped organize and spread the word about the Montgomery bus boycott that resulted from Mrs. Parks' bravery. Mrs. Robinson made and distributed copies, secured meeting space, and like dozens of women in Montgomery, Alabama, helped plan and run a highly efficient carpool system. We also do not often recall the training Mrs. Parks received in civics and civil disobedience under teachers like Septima Poinsett Clark. Next slide. And this is a picture of Septima Clark with Rosa Parks at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. For years, Clark, described as a natural teacher, trained civil rights activists and everyday citizens in the techniques to challenge Jim Crow. Septima Clark worked closely with another civil rights veteran, Ella Baker. Baker had been speaking out for the rights of African Americans for decades at this point, having gone out as a speaker and fundraiser for the NAACP starting in the 1930s. Within the confines of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the two women often worked in the shadow of the dominant pastors like MLK Jr. and Ralph Abernathy, but they kept the organization going and thriving. Baker remembered that she, for a time, was the only staff member at SCLC headquarters. Baker's experiences with sexism and hierarchy within older civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the SCLC shaped her message to the young students for who she would become a trusted, beloved advisor. As student protests via sit-ins and picket lines swept across the South in the early 1960s, she cautioned them to avoid a leader-centered movement. Young women like Diane Nash and Ruby Doris Smith Robinson tried to adhere to her advice, instituting a democratic organizational style as best they could in their student organizations and via other efforts. By the end of the 1960s, circumstances had changed dramatically for African Americans since 1900. Millions of them were able to vote. Many made their way towards the middle class. Some, reaping the benefits of the civil rights struggles, became the first in their families to go to college, hold professional jobs, or hold electoral office. Like Texas's own Barbara Jordan, who had been denied admission to UT at Austin because of segregation policies. She goes on to Texas Southern and then to Boston College, where she gets her law degree, keeps persevering, and she becomes the first Southern black woman elected to the House of Representatives. Jordan's story serves as testimony to the power of black women's determination, agitation, and powers of negotiation. These are much needed skills we have brought with us into the 21st century, and the struggles for a more just society continues. Thank you.